He thinks we are just taking a ride. Little does he know about the package.
Hook. The streets of Rome have a strange way of revealing the truth. Sometimes it comes through a courtroom, sometimes through a confession, and sometimes it arrives in the back seat of a taxi. Rain shimmered on the cobblestone streets outside Rome's private executive airport as a faded white taxi rolled quietly into the pickup lane. Its driver looked like any other man nearing 70. His gray hair peeked out from beneath a worn flat cap. His weathered hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, and a small wooden rosary hung from the rearview mirror, swaying gently with the wind. To everyone around him, he was simply Lorenzo, an old taxi driver known for always arriving on time and never asking questions. At exactly 9:15 p.m., three sharply dressed men emerged from the terminal carrying expensive leather briefcases. Their laughter echoed across the empty curb. The tallest of the three leaned toward the taxi window. City Center. Lorenzo smiled politely. Of course, gentlemen. As the doors closed and the taxi pulled into the rain-soaked streets, the passengers relaxed. One opened a bottle of rare whiskey. Another loosened his tie. The third laughed and said, "Can you believe it's been 20 years since we got rid of Giovanni De Luca?" The taxi remained perfectly steady. Only Lorenzo's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The men continued laughing. He begged for his brother's life before the warehouse burned. Best decision we ever made. In the rearview mirror, Lorenzo's calm eyes met theirs for the briefest moment. They saw nothing unusual. They didn't recognize the face that time had changed. They didn't know the quiet old driver was Don Lorenzo De Luca, the elder cousin of Alessandro De Luca, the last living witness to the murder they had just confessed. And before this ride ended, every lie they had buried for 2 decades would come back to claim them. Act 1. The fare that changed everything. The taxi glided through the rain as Rome's golden streetlights reflected across the wet pavement. Inside the cab, the 3 passengers laughed louder with every sip of whiskey. Lorenzo kept both hands on the steering wheel, his face calm, his breathing steady. But every word they spoke reopened a wound he had carried for 20 years. "I still remember that warehouse," one of the men said with a grin. "Your plan was brilliant." "It had to be," another replied. If Giovanni De Luca had lived, the De Luca family would have ruled Italy. The third man raised his glass. To the night the De Lucas finally fell. The 3 clinked their glasses together. Lorenzo's eyes briefly lifted to the rearview mirror. For an instant, he wasn't driving through modern Rome. He was back inside a burning warehouse, hearing gunfire, smoke filling the air, and his younger brother Giovanni shouting one final command. "Run, Lorenzo. Protect the family." It was the last time he had ever heard his brother's voice. A loud car horn snapped him back to the present. The traffic light had turned green. He drove on without saying a word. The passengers had no idea the quiet old driver had just relived the worst night of his life. As they crossed the Tiber River, the tallest man leaned forward. "Driver." "Yes, sir. Take the scenic route. We're celebrating." Lorenzo nodded politely. "As you wish." Instead of heading toward the city center, he guided the taxi along quieter streets lined with ancient stone buildings. He needed time. Time to listen. Time to learn. Time to confirm what his heart already believed. The shortest passenger laughed again. Funny thing is, nobody ever discovered who really ordered Giovanni's death. The tallest man smiled. They never will. Lorenzo's grip tightened ever so slightly on the steering wheel. Then the third passenger said something that changed everything. It wasn't Romano who gave the order. It was someone wearing the De Luca name. Silence filled the taxi. Even the other 2 passengers stopped smiling. Lorenzo felt his heartbeat slow, not from fear, but from certainty. His brother hadn't been destroyed by rivals alone. Someone from within the De Luca bloodline had helped orchestrate the murder. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined. And before dawn broke over Rome, Lorenzo vowed he would uncover the name of the traitor, even if it meant reopening wounds the De Luca family had spent decades trying to bury. Act 2. The recording. The rain grew heavier as the taxi wound through the quiet streets of Rome. None of the three passengers noticed Lorenzo's thumb gently press a hidden button beneath the steering wheel. A tiny recorder buried inside the dashboard came to life. Every word, every laugh, every confession. It was now being preserved. The tallest passenger stretched comfortably across the back seat. You know what I miss most? The fear. The moment people heard the De Luca name, they trembled. The shortest man chuckled. Not anymore. Now they're just stories told by old men. Lorenzo allowed himself the faintest smile. Legends had a way of surviving longer than empires. As they approached Castel Sant'Angelo, blue police lights flashed ahead. Traffic slowed to a crawl. The third passenger looked through the window. Perfect. No one's following us now. He leaned closer to the others and lowered his voice. Tomorrow night, the buyer arrives from Switzerland. The diamonds move through the Vatican corridor. No inspections. No customs. The tallest man nodded. And Ferraro? He suspects nothing. Lorenzo memorized every name, every location, every detail. This wasn't just about Giovanni anymore. These men were still running a criminal network that reached beyond Italy. Then came the sentence that made the taxi feel suddenly colder. The old De Luca files will disappear forever after tomorrow. The shortest man frowned. What about the priest? He'll never talk. And Alessandro? The tallest man laughed. Dead men don't return twice. Lorenzo looked into the rearview mirror. If only they knew. Alessandro had returned once already. Now another De Luca had stepped out of the shadows. The taxi finally reached the entrance of an exclusive hotel overlooking the piazza. Before stepping out, the tallest passenger placed several large bills on the center console. Keep the change, old man. Lorenzo accepted the money with a polite nod. Thank you, gentlemen. The three men walked toward the hotel, still laughing. They never noticed the tiny recording light blinking beneath the dashboard. Nor did they notice Lorenzo quietly following them with his eyes until the revolving doors closed behind them. He reached into the glove compartment and removed an old leather wallet. Inside was a faded photograph. Two young brothers stood side by side in front of the original De Luca estate. Giovanni had one arm around Lorenzo's shoulders. On the back, Giovanni had written years earlier, "If I ever fall, promise me you'll protect the truth." Lorenzo closed the wallet. For 20 years, he had honored that promise by staying hidden. Tonight, the truth had finally found its voice. Act 3. The Woman Who Remembered. Lorenzo did not drive away immediately. Instead, he parked 2 streets from the hotel and watched the entrance through the rain-speckled windshield. 20 years had taught him one lesson. The most dangerous criminals rarely traveled alone. Exactly 15 minutes later, a black Mercedes pulled up to the hotel. A woman in her early 60s stepped out. She wore an elegant charcoal coat, silver earrings, and carried herself with quiet confidence. The moment Lorenzo saw her face, his heart skipped. Claudia Romano. Years ago, she had worked as the De Luca family's legal advisor before mysteriously disappearing after Giovanni's murder. Lorenzo watched as the 3 men greeted her with unusual respect. This wasn't a business meeting. She was in charge. He picked up his camera and quietly captured several photographs. As Claudia turned toward the hotel entrance, she paused for just a second. Her eyes drifted toward Lorenzo's taxi. She couldn't possibly recognize him. Yet something in her expression suggested she had. Then she disappeared inside. The following morning, Lorenzo drove to a quiet cafe near the Pantheon. He had arranged to meet the only police officer he still trusted. Inspector Johnny Ferraro. The same detective who had helped Alessandro months earlier. Ferraro arrived wearing plain clothes. You sounded urgent. Lorenzo slid the recorder across the table. I need you to hear something. For nearly 10 minutes, the inspector listened without interruption. When the recording ended, he looked stunned. This confession could dismantle half the commission. If it's authentic. It is. Ferraro looked up. Who are you really? Lorenzo smiled faintly. Just an old taxi driver. Ferraro wasn't convinced. No. I've seen men carry grief. You carry responsibility. Before Lorenzo could answer, a waitress approached with fresh coffee. She placed the cups on the table and quietly whispered, "Leave now." Neither man reacted. She continued smiling as though nothing unusual had happened. "They're watching you." Then she walked away. Ferraro immediately glanced toward the cafe window. Across the street, a man pretending to read a newspaper lowered it just enough to reveal a small earpiece. Another sat inside a parked van. A third photographed the cafe from a nearby balcony. Ferraro muttered, "We've been compromised." Lorenzo calmly stood. "Take the recorder." "What about you?" "They're not following the evidence. They're following me." For the first time, Ferraro noticed something unusual. As Lorenzo walked away, the old taxi driver no longer looked tired. He walked with the confidence of a man who had survived wars, betrayals, and the collapse of an empire. And somewhere inside the hotel, Claudia Romano watched security footage of the cafe. She smiled sadly. "So, you really survived, Lorenzo." Then she whispered words no one else could hear. "Forgive me." Act 4. The Hidden Letter. Lorenzo left the cafe without looking back. Within seconds, 2 black sedans pulled into traffic behind his taxi. He smiled to himself. They're making it too easy. Instead of driving home, he headed toward the narrow streets of Trastevere, where tourists, scooters, and delivery vans crowded every corner. The sedans stayed close. 1 block. 2 blocks. 3. Then Lorenzo turned sharply into a covered parking garage. The sedans followed. The moment they entered, Lorenzo disappeared behind a concrete pillar. The drivers searched every level. His taxi was gone. Hidden behind an old maintenance gate was a narrow exit leading onto another street. It was an escape route Giovanni had shown him decades earlier. Some habits saved lives. An hour later, Lorenzo arrived at a quiet monastery overlooking Rome. Few people knew that beneath its stone chapel was a small archive once used by the De Luca family during the years when they hid documents from corrupt officials. Only Giovanni, Alessandro, and Lorenzo knew it existed. The old caretaker recognized him immediately. "I wondered if I'd ever see you again." Lorenzo nodded respectfully. "I need the archive." The caretaker handed him an old iron key. "It has been waiting for you." Deep beneath the chapel, Lorenzo unlocked a weathered wooden chest. Inside were ledgers, photographs, and sealed envelopes covered in dust. One envelope carried Giovanni's handwriting. "For Lorenzo, only if I never return." His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Brother, if you're reading this, then my fears were justified. The enemy isn't only outside the family. Someone wearing our name opened the gates. Don't seek revenge before you learn the whole truth. There are innocent people trapped in this betrayal. Trust the woman who carries the silver compass. She knows what really happened." Lorenzo read the final sentence twice. "Trust the woman who carries the silver compass." His mind raced. He had seen that compass before. Not years ago. Yesterday. Around Claudia Romano's neck. The woman he believed had betrayed the De Lucas might actually be the only person who knew the full truth. Before he could think further, footsteps echoed through the underground chamber. The caretaker rushed downstairs, out of breath. "Lorenzo, they've found the monastery. They're coming." Lorenzo folded the letter and slipped it into his coat. He looked once at Giovanni's signature. "I'll finish what you started." Then the chapel bells rang violently above them. Not for prayer. For warning. The hunters had arrived. Act 5. The Woman with the Silver Compass. The monastery bells echoed across the hillside as black SUVs surrounded the ancient stone walls. Armed men spread through the courtyard, sealing every exit. The old caretaker looked toward Lorenzo with fear in his eyes. "There are too many." Lorenzo remained calm. "No, there are too many for them." The caretaker frowned. Before he could ask what Lorenzo meant, another vehicle rolled through the gates. A dark blue sedan. The rear door opened. Claudia Romano stepped out alone. The silver compass pendant rested against her coat. She raised one hand. The gunmen lowered their weapons. "Lorenzo," she called. "You've been running for 20 years. It's time to stop." Lorenzo slowly walked into the courtyard. "You brought an army." I brought witnesses. She turned toward the armed men. Remove your masks. One by one, they obeyed. They weren't assassins. They were members of Italy's anti-mafia task force working undercover. The caretaker gasped. Lorenzo stood frozen. Claudia reached into her handbag and removed a worn leather folder. I never betrayed Giovanni. I became an informant the night he died. She handed him the folder. Inside were decades of evidence, financial records, coded ledgers, photographs, recordings, and sworn statements linking the commission to murders, corruption, and international smuggling. I spent 20 years pretending to serve them. So one day, I could destroy them. Lorenzo looked at her in disbelief. And the silver compass? Claudia smiled sadly. Your brother gave it to me. He said a compass always points toward the truth. Her voice trembled. I promised him I'd protect that truth, even if everyone believed I had betrayed him. Lorenzo finally understood. Giovanni had trusted her until the end. He had been wrong about many things over the years, but not about Claudia. Suddenly, Inspector Ferraro's radio crackled. They're moving. All commission members are leaving the hotel. Claudia looked at Lorenzo. They know we have the evidence. They're heading for the old harbor. They'll try to escape before sunrise. Lorenzo closed the folder and nodded. No, they'll face justice today. As police vehicles raced toward the harbor, Lorenzo climbed back into his taxi. Not because it was the fastest vehicle, but because for 20 years it had hidden the man no one was looking for. Tonight, the last ride was about to begin. Act 6. The Last Ride. The old harbor was wrapped in thick morning fog. Cargo ships waited silently at the docks while police units surrounded the outer roads without drawing attention. Inside Lorenzo's taxi, the city felt strangely peaceful. For 20 years, these streets had hidden his grief. Tonight, they would witness justice. At Pier 12, the three businessmen from the airport stood beside Don Vittorio Romano's remaining allies, loading black cases onto a waiting yacht. One of them checked his watch. Where's Claudia? She'll come. She always does. Before another word was spoken, a familiar white taxi rolled slowly onto the pier. The tallest businessman frowned. The old driver? Lorenzo stepped out. No cap. No smile. No disguise left to protect. I believe, he said calmly, you forgot to pay the full fare. The men laughed. Then Lorenzo pressed a small remote. From speakers hidden in police vehicles nearby, the recording from the taxi filled the harbor. Every confession, every boast, every admission of murder. The laughter disappeared. The businessmen stared at one another in panic. It's a trap. They rushed for the yacht, but armed officers emerged from every direction. Inspector Ferraro stepped forward. In the name of the Republic of Italy, you're under arrest. Some surrendered immediately. Others tried to flee. None escaped. The empire built on fear collapsed not through revenge, but through the truth they had spoken with their own voices. As officers secured the prisoners, the tallest businessman glared at Lorenzo. You waited 20 years. For this? Lorenzo nodded. My brother taught me something you never understood. Justice and revenge are not the same. The man lowered his head. For the first time in decades, he had no lies left to tell. 6 months later, the trial became one of the largest anti-mafia prosecutions in modern Italian history. Dozens of officials, financiers, and crime bosses were convicted. The hidden records collected by Claudia, together with the taxi recording and Giovanni's letter, exposed a network that had operated in silence for decades. Lorenzo testified only once. He never raised his voice. He simply told the truth. After the trial, he drove one final fare. An elderly woman needed a ride to the cemetery. She spoke kindly throughout the journey, unaware of the man behind the wheel. When they arrived, Lorenzo remained after she left. He walked to a quiet grave marked Giovanni de Luca. He placed Giovanni's faded photograph beside fresh flowers. The truth found its way home, he whispered. A gentle breeze stirred the trees. For the first time in 20 years, the weight on his heart felt lighter. He looked toward the sunrise over Rome, started the taxi one last time, and drove away, not as a hunted ghost, but as a brother who had finally kept his promise. Because empires may rise and fall, but the strongest legacy is never built on fear. It is built on truth. The end.